June 28, 1941, near Minsk, Soviet Union. The captured Soviet vehicle sat abandoned near a destroyed Red Army column. Its crew, having fled when their position became untenable, left the machine intact. Standard Wehrmacht procedure dictated destroying it, but the Panzer unit's commanding officer had other ideas. "Get our best mechanics. I want to know if we can use this thing." What the Panzergruppe mechanics discovered in the next 30 minutes would challenge everything they believed about German technological superiority. The realization didn't come as a thunderbolt, but as a creeping, horrifying understanding. The placard on the dash was in Cyrillic. The Germans called it the T-34. The first revelation came when they climbed on the hull. The armor was welded crudely, with ugly, unfinished seams, but it was sloped everywhere. The 45 millimeters of steel was angled back dramatically. In 2 decades of servicing German military vehicles, the senior mechanic had never seen such a functional design. Every German tank, the Panzer III and IV, used flat, vertical plates, which were easier to manufacture perfectly. This Soviet design was not built to be perfect. It was built to deflect shells. This aggressive angling meant the 45 millimeter plate had the effective resistance of over 75 millimeters of vertical steel. The Germans' own 37 millimeters and short 50 millimeter anti-tank guns, which had dominated in France, would be useless against this. Their shells would simply ricochet off. By late 1941, the contrast between German and Soviet tank philosophy had become stark. Germany's complex, high-quality panzers were engineering marvels, but the Soviets, despite catastrophic losses and moving their factories east of the Urals, were already outproducing them in this new, terrifying design. More troubling was what this disparity represented. The T-34 embodied a ruthless pragmatism. It was standardized, simplified, and designed for mass production by unskilled workers. It was a philosophy of quantity has a quality all its own, but this time the quantity also had quality. The officers approached as the mechanics continued their inspection. "Well, can we use it?" The senior mechanic looked up, his face grim. "This vehicle is remarkable. It's designed by someone who understands what truly matters in a tank-on-tank fight. Not comfort, not finish, just lethality." One officer frowned. "German engineering is the finest in the world. Look at this casting. It's primitive." The mechanic didn't argue. He simply gestured to the long 76.2 mm L11 gun. "This gun is larger and more powerful than our main tank cannons. It can kill us from a kilometer away." The Wehrmacht's primary tanks, the Panzer III and IV, were excellent machines. They were reliable, comfortable for the crew, and had superb optics. They were the product of a sophisticated industrial base. But they had been designed to fight the inferior tanks of Poland and France. Their armor was thin and vertical. Their guns were small caliber. They were not designed to fight this. The T-34, by contrast, was a blunt instrument designed for one purpose: to survive and to kill other tanks. And it was superior in both regards. The mechanics continued their inspection. The suspension used a Christie system. It was crude compared to the German torsion bars, lacking finesse. But it gave the tank incredible high-speed, cross-country performance. The T-34 was faster off-road than the German Panzers were on-road. Then they looked at the tracks. They were 500 millimeters wide, almost double the width of the tracks on the Panzer III. This was the second revelation. The German mechanic realized with a chill what this meant. These mud-shoe tracks spread the tank's 26-ton weight over a huge area. German Panzers, with their narrow bicycle-like tracks, were already getting stuck in the summer mud, the Rasputitsa. The mechanic understood that when winter came, these T-34s would float over the snow and mud, while the entire German army would be immobilized, frozen in place. This wasn't the Asiatic horde incompetence that German propaganda had promised. This was engineering focused on the brutal reality of the Eastern Front, rather than the theories of a peacetime proving ground. This was a war-winning design. The unit brought the T-34 back to their forward maintenance area. Over the next 3 days, they conducted exhaustive tests. They drove it through soft mud, where their own panzers bogged down. They were shocked by its speed and brutal agility. The T-34 simply powered through. Word spread like wildfire through the Panzergruppe. The Soviets had a wonder weapon. Officers and mechanics from other units came to examine it. The reactions followed a predictable pattern. Initial skepticism at the crude welds, followed by grudging respect for the gun, then sheer terror at the sloped armor. A supply officer who had worked at the Henschel tank plants before the war spent an afternoon studying the vehicle. His assessment was blunt. This represents a fundamental difference in approach. We build for precision and craftsmanship. The Soviets build for effect. In this war that matters more. He explained what that meant to the assembled officers. Look at this hull, it's rough, the interior is unpainted steel. The crew comforts are non-existent, but who cares? The armor is sloped, the gun is powerful, the tracks are wide. They have sacrificed everything that doesn't matter for everything that does. They can train an unskilled factory worker, probably a woman, to weld these hulls in a week. They are building them faster than we can. We are building our panzers like craftsmen. They are building these like an assembly line. We cannot match this capacity. The officers fell silent. He had articulated what many had begun to suspect. Germany's philosophy, focused on high-quality, complex and perfect vehicles, had made sense in the short war against France. But here in Russia, the Soviet approach of good enough delivered in massive numbers was proving devastating. One mechanic spent that evening writing a detailed technical report. He documented the T-34's revolutionary design, noting its unprecedented combination of sloped armor, wide tracks, and a powerful all-purpose gun. This report, and hundreds like it, made their way up the chain of command. These reports flooded into Wehrmacht headquarters, all saying the same thing. The Panzer III was obsolete. The Panzer IV was outgunned. The standard 37mm anti-tank gun was now mockingly nicknamed the Hirschenklopfgerät, the Army's doorknocker, because its shells just bounced off the T-34's hull. In late 1941, Wehrmacht intelligence, including the famed General Guderian himself, commissioned a special study of this new Soviet tank. The results confirmed their worst fears. Guderian's report was blunt. The T-34 was, in his words, vastly superior to any tank Germany currently possessed. The statistics revealed a sobering truth. The Soviets had mobilized their entire economy. Factories were being evacuated beyond the Ural Mountains, where they were being reassembled in open, snow-covered fields. Production was not just continuing, it was accelerating in the face of invasion. The captured T-34 became something of a dark legend in its unit. Soldiers avoided it, calling it crude and Bolshevik. But the officers and mechanics knew the truth. When they could, they used it, trusting its armor far more than their own. By early 1942, the Wehrmacht had captured hundreds of T-34s. They were so desperate for effective tanks that they put them back into service against their former masters. Designated as the Panzerkampfwagen T-34 747R, they were prized by their new German crews. Then came the winter of 1941. The Wehrmacht, stalled at the gates of Moscow, collapsed. The mechanics' fears about the tracks were realized. The German panzers, with their narrow tracks and delicate transmissions, were frozen solid in the deep mud and snow. They were immobilized. The T-34s, with their wide tracks and rugged Christie suspension, were not. They continued to maneuver, to counterattack, to encircle and destroy the frozen German units. The T-34 was not just a good tank. It was the right tank for this specific brutal war. The mechanics also made a third discovery, one that was just as shocking as the armor. They opened the rear engine hatch and found an aluminum V2 diesel engine. A diesel engine in a tank. This was almost unheard of in German design. German tanks all ran on high-octane gasoline. This was a logistical nightmare. It was highly flammable, and it was the same precious fuel the Luftwaffe desperately needed. The T-34's diesel engine was less flammable, more torque-heavy, and used a completely different and more available fuel supply. The Soviets had not just designed a better tank, they had designed a better logistical system. The T-34 was faster, better armored, better armed, and logistically simpler to support than the panzers it was facing. The shock to the German psyche was absolute. This was the moment the Panzer shock truly began. It wasn't just the troops at the front, it was the engineers and designers back in Germany. The reports from the front were so alarming that Hitler demanded an immediate response. A special Panzer Commission was sent to the Eastern Front in November 1941. It included the top tank designers from Porsche, Henschel, MAN, and Daimler-Benz. They were sent to Guderian's headquarters to inspect captured T-34s and figure out how to build a tank that could beat it. What followed was an educational afternoon for Germany's best engineers. They stood around a captured, battle-scarred T-34, much like the mechanics had done months earlier. They measured the armor angles. They analyzed the Christie suspension. They marveled at the 12-cylinder diesel engine. One German engineer, a man from MAN, looked at the crude, massive castings of the T-34's turret. "We cannot build this," he said. "Our production methods are too precise. We do not have the machinery to cast armor on this crude but massive scale." He was right. German factories were built for quality, not quantity. They relied on skilled craftsmen. The Soviet factories, like the massive Tankergrad complex in the Urals, were built for one purpose: to produce T-34s by the thousand, using unskilled labor. This was the secret German manufacturing could not copy: component commonality. The Soviets had one medium tank, the T-34, and one heavy tank, the KV-1. Germany was building the Panzer Worms II, the III, IV, and multiple captured Czech designs, all with different parts. The journey to this realization had been brutal. At every step, the Germans had assumed their inferior enemy was incapable of such innovation. Now, standing in the bitter cold, they realized the enemy was not just innovative. They were more practical and more focused. The German response to the T-34 was split. One group, led by Daimler-Benz, argued for a direct, literal copy of the T-34. They wanted to build a German version. This proposal was the ultimate admission of their own design's failure. The other group, led by Henschel and MAN, argued that German quality could still win. They proposed a new, complex design that would combine German engineering with the T-34's key features. This project would eventually become the Panzer IV Panther. But the Panther was a flawed response. It copied the T-34's form, its sloped armor, but not its philosophy, its simplicity. The Panther was hideously complex, mechanically unreliable, and a nightmare to produce. It was a perfect tank that rarely worked. The German mechanics on the front lines had seen this coming. They had understood that the T-34's strength was its simplicity, not its features. The High Command had learned the wrong lesson. They copied the sloped armor, but ignored the reliable, mass-produced soul. The T-34, by contrast, just kept getting simpler and faster to build. By 1943, a T-34 could be built in a fraction of the man-hours of a Panther. The Soviets were building tanks that worked, while the Germans were building tanks that were engineering marvels, but logistical failures. The captured mechanics had seen this truth. The T-34 wasn't elegant, but sophistication was proving to be a weakness in a war of attrition. The T-34 was a blunt instrument, and it was crushing the superior German scalpel. By summer 1943, at the Battle of Kursk, this new reality was undeniable. The Germans debuted their new Panthers and Tigers, which were mechanically fragile. They were met by thousands of improved T-34s. The new German tanks broke down constantly, while the T-34s, though outgunned, swarmed them. The German offensive, Hitler's last great gamble in the East, ground to a halt. It was not just a tactical defeat, it was a material one. The Soviets were now outproducing and outdesigning Germany in the categories that truly mattered. The arithmetic was staggering. In 1943, Germany built roughly 1,800 Panthers and 1,000 Tigers. The Soviets built over 15,000 T-34s. The disparity was not just quantitative, it was philosophical. The T-34 was a weapon designed to be available. The Panther was a weapon designed to be admired. The T-34's design was so effective that the Wehrmacht used captured 747R models throughout the war. They were often reserved for veteran crews or commanders who appreciated their reliability and brutal effectiveness despite the crude interior and poor optics. The real genius of the T-34 was that it was future-proofed. The hull was so large and well-designed that it could be easily upgraded. When the Germans introduced the Tiger, the Soviets responded not with a new tank, but by putting a larger 85mm gun on the same T-34 chassis. The German mechanic who wrote that first report in 1941 had been prophetic. He had identified the sloped armor, the wide tracks, and the powerful gun. He had seen the future of tank warfare, and it was not German. This was the fundamental difference. German production relied on skilled craftsmen. Soviet production relied on semi-skilled workers, many of them women, building one adequate product in massive quantities. This was a war Germany could not win. The T-34 was not just a vehicle. It was a symbol of a different approach to war. It was a symbol of good enough, being superior to perfect. It was a lesson the Wehrmacht learned in the mud and snow, but could do nothing about. The mechanics had examined the T-34 and recognized the truth. The vehicle wasn't elegant, but elegance didn't stop bullets, and it didn't cross mud. Sloped armor and wide tracks did. The Soviets had built a tank for the real world, not the drawing board. By 1944, the T-34-85 was the most produced tank of the war. It was rolling across Eastern Europe, pushing the Wehrmacht back to Berlin. The Panzer shock of 1941 had become a tidal wave that was drowning the Third Reich. The officers who had scoffed at the primitive casting had been proven wrong. The mechanic who had pointed at the gun had been right. The T-34 was a tool of war, and it was ruthlessly efficient at its job. The mechanics had seen the truth in 30 minutes of inspection. A truth that the German High Command, blinded by its own arrogance and obsession with complexity, had failed to grasp until it was too late. The T-34 that captured crude, abandoned vehicle near Minsk was a warning. It was a sign that German engineering, for all its brilliance, was not enough. It was a sign that the war was about to be won by a different and far more brutal philosophy. The German Tank Commission returned from the Eastern Front with their report. Their conclusion was unanimous and terrifying. The T-34 had rendered their existing tank doctrine completely obsolete. Germany had to change, or it would lose the war. This was the moment the arms race truly began. The German response was twofold, and both paths were flawed. The first was to create the Panzer-IV Panther. It was a direct answer to the T-34, copying its sloped armor, long gun, and excellent suspension. But it was a German interpretation of the design. Where the T-34 was simple, the Panther was hideously complex. Where the T-34 was reliable, the Panther was a mechanical nightmare, its transmission and final drive constantly failing. It was a perfect tank that rarely worked, built by craftsmen, not by an assembly line. The second response was the Panzer VI Tiger. This was a different philosophy, a heavy breakthrough tank. It was a masterpiece of engineering, with a devastating 80 mm gun and armor the T-34 could not penetrate. But it was also a logistical black hole. Germany built only 1-347 Tigers and 6,000 Panthers. In that same time, the Soviet Union, from its new factories in the Urals, produced over 50,000 T-34s. The math was brutal. The Germans had built a handful of exquisite snipers, while the Soviets had built an unstoppable tide of steel. The mechanics who had first inspected that T-34 in 1941 could have predicted this. They had seen the philosophy of mass production welded crudely onto its hull. The Germans, obsessed with perfection, were incapable of replicating the T-34's true strength, its simplicity. The Soviet factory system was the real wonder weapon. At Tankograd in Chelyabinsk, T-34s were being assembled on the largest moving assembly line in the world. Unskilled workers, many of them women and teenagers who had been farmers months before, were churning out tanks 24 hours a day. They sacrificed everything for speed. They didn't paint the interiors. They often didn't even have seats for the crew. The welds were ugly, but the tanks worked, and they were produced at a rate that Germany, with its skilled artisan-based manufacturing, could not even comprehend. This relentless pressure forced Germany to simplify its own production, but it was too little, too late. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, tried to rationalize production, but he was fighting a culture that believed quality was the only path to victory. The T-34, meanwhile, was constantly being improved based on frontline reports. When the first Tigers appeared, Soviet crews were horrified. Their 76mm guns couldn't penetrate its armor. The solution, however, was typically pragmatic. They didn't design a new complex tank. They simply took the existing proven T-34 hull and mounted a much larger turret with a more powerful 85mm anti-aircraft gun. The result was the T-34-85. It was the same cheap, fast, mass-produced tank, but now it could kill tigers and panthers. This was the T-34's ultimate genius. The design was so robust and forward-thinking that it could be upgraded and remain lethal for the entire war. The German Panzer III, by contrast, was a dead end. Its chassis was too small to ever mount a gun that could matter. The German mechanics on the Eastern Front, who were now tasked with maintaining the complex Panthers and Tigers, must have looked at the T-34 with a kind of bitter envy. Their own tanks required massive specialized recovery vehicles and days of maintenance for simple repairs. A broken T-34, by contrast, was often repaired by its own crew in a few hours with a hammer, a wrench, and brute force. Its parts were interchangeable. Its diesel engine was rugged. It was a tank designed to be abused by conscripts and still function. The psychological impact on the German Panzertruppen was profound. In 1941, they were masters of the world, riding in superior machines. By 1943, they were crews of glass cannons, powerful but mechanically fragile. They feared their own transmissions as much as the enemy. The T-34, for all its crudeness, gave its crew confidence. The sloped armor offered a chance of survival. The wide tracks meant they would not get stuck. The reliable engine meant they would make it back to base. It was a soldier's tank. German crews in captured T-34s loved them. They reported that while the optics were terrible and the noise was deafening, the tank was reliable and effective. It was the perfect synthesis of mobility, protection, and firepower, a combination their own industry had failed to achieve. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was the final proof. It was the largest tank battle in history. Germany threw its new Panthers and Tigers against a defense in depth, anchored by thousands of T-34s. The new German tanks broke down in massive numbers before even reaching the enemy. The T-34s, by contrast, were available in endless, overwhelming waves. Though they took horrific losses, there was always another one. They swarmed the superior German tanks, closing the distance to hit their weaker side armor. It was a victory of quantity and good enough design. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht never again held the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. They were in a constant, desperate retreat, bled dry by an enemy that produced tanks like sausages from a machine, as one German general bitterly remarked. The T-34 was the tank that pushed them all the way back to Berlin. It was the tank that rolled through the streets of Budapest, Warsaw, and Vienna. It was the tank that finally parked its wide, muddy tracks on the rubble of the Reichstag in 1945. Its legacy is not just in its numbers, but in its influence. The T-34 created the concept of the main battle tank, MBT. It was not a light, medium, or heavy tank. It was just a tank. It could do everything. Every tank designer after 1941, including the Americans, was forced to respond to it. The American M4 Sherman, with its high profile and vertical armor, was already obsolete when it was being designed because the T-34 had rewritten the rules. The post-war American M46 Patton, with its sloped armor and powerful gun, was a direct descendant of the T-34's design philosophy. The Soviets had not just won a battle, they had won the intellectual argument over tank design for the next 30 years. The German mechanics who first opened that engine hatch near Minsk in 1941 were the prophets of this new age. They saw, with the clarity of professionals, that the rules of war had changed. They had seen an inferior enemy produce a superior weapon. Their report and the hundreds like it was a warning that went unheeded. The German High Command could not, or would not, abandon its obsession with technological perfection. They could not accept that a crude tank was better than their masterpieces. The T-34 was a victory of pragmatism. The Soviets identified the three things that mattered: sloped armor, a big gun, and wide tracks. They sacrificed every other consideration, crew comfort, build quality, optics, noise level, to perfect those three. This ruthless focus was something the German system, with its competing bureaus and artisan engineering, could not match. The T-34 was a product of a total, unified and desperate war economy. The Panther was the product of a peacetime engineering competition. In the end, the T-34 was not just a vehicle, it was a philosophy. It was the philosophy that in a total war of attrition, the best tank is the one that is good enough, and there, on the battlefield, in the thousands. The German soldier, who had been taught he was a Superman, was defeated by this philosophy. He was defeated by an enemy who had more tanks, and whose tanks were, in the ways that mattered, simply better. The Panzer shock of 1941 was not just a tactical surprise. It was a strategic, industrial and psychological catastrophe. It was the moment the Wehrmacht realized that their quick, easy war was over, and a new, brutal war of annihilation had begun. The T-34 was the perfect weapon for that new war. It was cheap, it was brutal, it was effective, and it was endless. It was the tank that had been designed for the mud and snow, for the vast distances, and for the ruthless reality of the Eastern Front. The story of the T-34 is a story of how a supposedly primitive nation, through sheer focused and pragmatic genius, created the most decisive and influential weapon of the ground war. It was a revolution in steel. The German officers, who had scoffed at the crude welds in 1941, had been proven catastrophically wrong. The mechanic who had pointed at the wide tracks had been right. The T-34 was a tool of war, and it was ruthlessly efficient. The T-34 was not just good enough. It was, for its time and place, the perfect weapon. It was a masterpiece of wartime engineering, not in its complexity, but in its brutal, terrifying simplicity. The German High Command, blinded by arrogance, had confused sophistication with superiority. The T-34 taught them, at the cost of millions of lives, that the two are not the same. True superiority is being able to produce 15,000 tanks a year. The T-34's legacy is written in the outcome of the war. It was the tank that absorbed the Wehrmacht's initial assault, bled it dry in the winter, crushed it at Kursk, and chased it back to Berlin. No other weapon had such a decisive impact. The mechanics who had gathered around that first captured tank were the first to understand. They were the first to see the fatal flaw, not in the T-34, but in their own philosophy. They had seen the future, and it was painted olive drab. The T-34, that crude and primitive machine, was in fact the most modern tank of its time. It was the German Panzers, with their vertical armor and complex engineering, that were the true relics of a bygone era. The German Panzer was a duelist's rapier. The T-34 was an executioner's axe. In the brutal, mass-scale slaughter of the Eastern Front, the axe had won. The age of quality was over. The age of mass-produced, good-enough lethality had begun. The T-34 was a weapon that perfectly matched the doctrine of the Red Army: deep battle. It was fast enough to exploit breakthroughs and numerous enough to be everywhere. It was the engine of the Soviet steamroller. The final analysis, written by German generals after the war, was unanimous. The T-34 and the industrial philosophy it represented was one of the primary reasons for their defeat. They had been outdesigned and outproduced by an enemy they had fatally underestimated. The invincible Panzerwaffe had been broken by a tank that was, in many ways, its opposite. A tank that was crude, simple and ugly, but also reliable, effective, and above all, available. The story of the T-34 is a warning against arrogance. It is a warning that the best technology is not always the most complex. It is a warning that you should never underestimate an enemy, especially one that has embraced a philosophy of brutal simplicity. The T-34's diesel engine, its wide tracks and its sloped armor, were not just design features, they were a declaration. They were a statement that the Soviet Union understood the realities of this war in a way that Germany did not. The German mechanics' report from 1941 was an epitaph for their own army, written before the main battle had even been fought. They had seen the enemy's strength and their own fatal weakness in the design of a single captured tank. The T-34's influence is so vast that even today its core principles, sloped armor, a long gun, and good mobility, are the bedrock of all main battle tank design. It was not just a tank. It was the template for all future tanks. When the war ended, American and British engineers eagerly studied the T-34. They too were humbled. They recognized that their own tanks, the Sherman and the Cromwell, had been inferior. The T-34 had been the true standard of the war. The Panzer shock had not just been a German experience, it was a global one. The T-34 had forced every army in the world to rethink what a tank was supposed to be, and that revolution in thinking had all started with a captured, abandoned vehicle near Minsk. The German soldiers who had to fight it paid the price for their high command's arrogance. They were sent to fight a revolutionary weapon with obsolete tools. Their 37mm door knockers were a tragic symbol of a nation that had been outthought and outbuilt. The T-34's legacy is ultimately one of brutal pragmatism. It was a weapon that made no apologies. It did not care about crew comfort. It only cared about winning. And it did. The German super tanks, the Panther and Tiger, were a response to a question the T-34 had already answered. But they were the wrong answer. They were complex solutions to a problem that the Soviets had solved with simplicity. The confidence of the Wehrmacht in June 1941 was real, but it was based on a false premise. They were not invincible. Their equipment was not superior. It was a paper tiger that was about to be mauled by a real steel one. The mechanics who had gathered around that T-34, their hands greasy and their faces grim, were the first to know the war was lost. They had seen the future of armored warfare, and it was a future for which Germany was completely and fatally unprepared. The lesson from that field near Minsk was simple. Do not confuse complexity with capability. The T-34 was simple, and it was the most capable tank on the battlefield for 3 long years. The T-34 was not just a tank, it was a revolution in steel, a symbol of a new kind of industrial warfare. It was the weapon that proved that good enough, when delivered in overwhelming numbers, is superior to perfect, delivered too late. The German mechanics' discovery was not just about a piece of hardware. It was a discovery about a philosophy that would grind the Wehrmacht to dust and carry the Red Army to Berlin. The T-34, crude, ugly, and effective, was the tank that won the Second World War on the Eastern Front. It was the ultimate workhorse, a machine designed not for parades, but for the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of total war.